Okay, let's get to our guest tonight. Our guest tonight is a gentleman by the name of Michael A. Hoffman. He is the author of a recent history book entitled They Were White and They Were Slaves. It's the untold story of the enslavement of white people in early America. Mr. Hoffman was educated at Oswego State Teachers College and Hobart College. He is a former reporter for the Albany and Buffalo, New York bureaus of the Associated Press and a former director of the Institute for Historical Review. He is the author of 3 other books, by the way, and has published also a bi-monthly history newsletter entitled Revisionist Researcher. And Mr. Hoffman, are you with us tonight?
Yes, I am.
Appreciate you being with us tonight. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Good. Well, you've done magnificent work on a book that, as I don't have to tell you, is not politically correct.
That's right. It isn't at all.
How's it being received out there?
Well, it's being received as sort of a samizdat publication. People are ordering it through bookstores, and there's a growing audience for it. We've sold several thousand copies, and I think that the more publicity that it gets, eventually the audience will grow nationwide and worldwide, God willing.
Well, let's start talking about it. I got some questions to ask you. Now, we've been told that black people have been enslaved and oppressed in America for 400 years, and that the American people need to make reparations to blacks. Perhaps sometimes it's suggested cash payments. And as a result, they're saying of this black enslavement, that's the least we can do. Now, you've written a book claiming that it was the white people who were actually the first slaves in America. So who owes who, Mr. Hoffman?
Well, white people don't owe anyone, Pastor Peters. The fact of the matter is that white youth today are taught that black slaves and Mexican peons and Chinese coolies built this country, while the vast majority of the whites lorded it over them with a whiplash in one hand, and a mint julep in the other. But the documentary record tells a very different story. Up to 1/2 of all the arrivals in the American colonies were white slaves, and they were America's first slaves. These whites were slaves for life, long before blacks ever were. And this white slavery was even hereditary. White children were born to white slaves, and they were also enslaved. Whites were auctioned on a block with children sold and separated from their parents. Wives were sold and separated from their husbands. Meanwhile, you had free black property owners walking the streets of northern and southern American cities, while white slaves were being worked to death in the sugar mills of Barbados and Jamaica in the West Indies and in the tobacco plantations of Virginia. So the establishment has created this misnomer of indentured servitude to explain away and minimize the fact of white slavery. But if you really read even the establishment historians, if you read their footnotes, even they have to concede, at the very least in the 17th century, that black slavery was almost non-existent and that whites were the overwhelming majority of slaves in America in the 17th century.
Where does the word slave itself come from? Isn't it exclusively in reference to the experience of black people in bondage?
No, it isn't, Pastor Peters. Actually, the word slave derives from the white nation of people known as the Slavs, or the Slavic people. And they were enslaved longer than the entire history of the United States. The Slavic people were slaves about twice as long as blacks were slaves in North America. So the actual definition of that word pertains to the experience of white people in bondage, yet the politically correct historians tell us that we're not allowed to refer to whites as slaves. So it's really a huckster's game that's at work there.
It's that old wordsmith game, isn't it?
That's correct.
How did the enslavement of whites in America begin, anyway?
Well, the enslavement of whites in America really actually has its roots in Great Britain, because it's really a very complex story. Of course, the history of whites in bondage goes all the way back to the ancient world. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, of course, held slaves, and the majority of those slaves were whites. This has pretty much been the essential experience of all people throughout time, and it's ludicrous to say that it's exclusively the experience of blacks. However, if we bring this up to the American colonial period, we must go to Britain because, of course, America was a colony of Britain. And Britain began its decline in the 16th century, shortly after the reign of Henry VIII. I would say it went into decline under his son, the very weak boy king, Edward VI. And in the era of Edward VI, we see that usury, or the charging of interest on loans, that had been illegal in Britain. And during the reign of Edward VI, he was being manipulated by his counselors, and that's when usury was legalized in Britain in 1548. And from that point onward, you also had the beginnings of the enclosure laws, which was the taking away of the right of the English people to farm freely in these common lands which had existed. They were basically swindled out of their land. And from that, you had a pauperization process beginning. You had the first real beginnings of a class of white people in Great Britain known as paupers. And once you had that, of course, you had all the social evils that came along with the paupers. Now, pauperization began in a large-scale way under Queen Elizabeth I, and this is when you had the first welfare laws in Britain being passed. And when white people who had formerly been yeomen, who had been freemen, now there had been a class of white slaves in early Britain known as the villains, from which we get the disparaging term of villain. It was spelled a little bit differently with an E on the end instead of an A. However, you still had a majority of the whites able to farm and able to live as free men. Now, more and more, the majority of whites were changing over from free men and yeomen and landholders and farmers over to this class, this formal class of paupers. And that's what began the roots of white slavery, because once you had paupers, you had developing the workhouse system, which was the way to manage the paupers, which was to enslave them in an institution where they could be controlled, which was the workhouse system in Great Britain.
That's an amazing story. In fact, it's so amazing that I know there are some people, just using the understanding cognitive dissonance, that they're rejecting some of the things you're saying because it seems so fantastic that they've never heard this. What happened to whites in Great Britain if they opposed the king or they were defeated in battle? You know, in high school today and in colleges, we're told that the whites have been so-called indentured servants. That we do hear about some of indentured servants in America, but never slaves. And I know you address it in the book, and I want you to tell the people about it.
Right. Well, first of all, of course, you had battle captives and people who were opposing the king, or if they lost in battle in the various civil wars and rebellions in Great Britain. Generally, one of their punishments, if they were fortunate enough to escape execution, was enslavement. And what would happen to them is they would be transported. That was in a technical term. It didn't just mean that you were put on a ship, but it was actually a term related to forced deportation from Great Britain. And these various white rebels against the crown were then transported to the British Crown colonies of the West Indies, particularly Barbados and Jamaica, where they were basically worked to death in the sugar mills there. And when white tourists go to Jamaica and Barbados, they're basically going to the scene of a white Holocaust, because most of these white men didn't survive beyond the first couple of years there. However, this enslavement was long-term. It just did not involve only political prisoners or those who had lost battles, but it also involved the kidnapping, as I will discuss later, of whites off the streets of Great Britain, so that even in the early parts of the